It was the fall of 2012 when I found myself staying in my uncle's cabin in the dense mountains of western North Carolina. I had just turned 26 and was going through a rough patch in life. The cabin was meant to give me some peace and time to figure things out. My uncle, a retired forest ranger, had owned the place for years but rarely used it. It was isolated, surrounded by thick forest, and perched on the edge of a steep slope overlooking a small valley. The place was sturdy, built from heavy timber, with a metal roof that had seen decades of mountain storms. The first day I arrived, the weather was clear and brisk. I spent the afternoon chopping firewood, airing out the cabin, and making the small place feel a bit more like home. The smell of old pine and wood smoke hung in the air. The cabin had no electricity, just a wood stove, a propane lantern, and a few old kerosene lamps. The nearest town was a good 40-minute drive down a winding dirt road, and cell service was non-existent. On the second night, a heavy rain moved in. By late afternoon, the clouds had swallowed the mountain, and the steady sound of rain tapping against the metal roof became a constant background noise. The rain turned into a downpour just as night fell. I had built a good fire in the wood stove, and the cabin was warm and dry. I sat at the small table near the window, reading by lantern light. The rain made it impossible to see anything outside, and the dense fog that came with it only added to the feeling of isolation. I didn't mind the rain at first. It was calming in a way, a white noise that drowned out everything else. But as the hours passed, a strange unease began to settle over me. It wasn't any one thing that set me off, more like a collection of small details. The way the wind occasionally howled through the trees outside, the creaks and groans of the old cabin settling, the pitch-black darkness beyond the lantern's glow. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous. This was the kind of quiet I had come here for, wasn't it? Around 9 p.m., the rain grew heavier. It pounded against the roof like gravel, and water began streaming off the eaves in thick sheets. I decided to double-check the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. The cabin had 2 doors, one at the front and one leading out to a small covered porch in the back. Both were locked. The windows, though old and single-paned, had sturdy latches. Everything seemed fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I sat back down and tried to read, but the words on the page blurred together. My mind kept drifting. Every now and then, I thought I heard something over the rain, faint sounds that didn't belong. A thud, a snap, maybe just a branch falling. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't focus. By 10:30, I decided to call it a night. I doused the lantern and climbed into the old iron frame bed in the corner. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint orange light across the room. I pulled the heavy quilt up to my chin and listened to the rain. It was still pouring, but now and then, there were lulls where it softened, letting me hear the forest more clearly. The sound of the creek at the bottom of the slope, swollen with runoff. The occasional groan of a tree swaying in the wind. The distant crack of something heavy falling in the woods. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was awake in the dark, my heart pounding. For a moment, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a loud, deliberate knock at the front door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I waited, listening. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a third, slower knock. My first thought was that it must be an animal, a bear maybe pawing at the door, but the sound was too precise, too deliberate. It was a hand. Someone was out there. I sat up in bed, straining to hear over the rain. The knocking stopped, but now I could hear faint movement outside. Footsteps on the wet ground, moving around the cabin. They were slow, deliberate, as if whoever it was didn't care about being quiet. My chest tightened as I realized how isolated I was. No phone,
No neighbors.
Just miles of dark forest in every direction. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left by the bed and switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the small room. I debated my next move. Should I call out? Open the door? Neither option felt right. I decided to stay quiet and wait, hoping whoever it was would go away. The footsteps moved to the back of the cabin. I heard the faint creak of the porch boards under their weight. Then silence. My heart was racing now, every muscle in my body tense. I held my breath, listening for any sound. A minute passed, then two. Just as I began to think they had left, there was a loud bang on the back door, so hard it rattled the frame. I jumped, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Whoever it was wasn't trying to hide anymore. I grabbed the old hunting knife my uncle had left hanging on the wall and stood up. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. The banging came again, this time followed by the sound of the doorknob jiggling. They were trying to get in. I backed into the corner of the room, the knife held tight in one hand, the flashlight in the other. The door held, but the noise didn't stop. Bang, bang, bang. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. The rain had let up slightly, and in the quiet that followed, I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I stayed where I was, too scared to move. Finally, I worked up the courage to approach the window, keeping the flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. I peeked out, but it was too dark to see anything beyond the faint outline of trees. Whoever it was, they were gone, or so it seemed. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the corner with my back to the wall, the knife and flashlight in my lap. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside made me jump. The rain finally stopped just before dawn, and as the first light of day crept into the cabin, I forced myself to go outside and look around. The ground was soaked, the dirt turned to mud. I found footprints, large, booted prints, circling the cabin. They led from the front door to the back porch and then disappeared into the woods. I followed them a short way until they veered off down the slope, where the dense undergrowth made it impossible to track them further. I packed up and left that morning, driving down the mountain as fast as the muddy road would allow. I never told my uncle what happened. I didn't even tell myself, not really. I didn't want to think about who or what had been outside that night, or why they were there. But sometimes, when it rains and the night feels too quiet, I remember the sound of that knocking, and I wonder if I'll ever feel truly safe again. The rain started as I pulled up to the old cabin, just a soft patter on the windshield at first. I had rented the place for the weekend, hoping for a quiet escape. Work had been a grind, and the thought of spending a few days alone in the countryside, far from emails and phone calls, was too good to pass up. I'd found the listing online, a small cabin in the middle of nowhere, tucked into a wooded corner of rural Wales. It was an old stone building with a slate roof and a single chimney. The photos showed it sitting on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees and dense underbrush. It seemed perfect. The drive had taken longer than expected. The directions were vague, and the tiny, winding roads were slippery with the rain that had been threatening all day. By the time I arrived, it was already dark. I killed the engine, stepped out of the car, and felt the wet cold immediately seep through my coat. The air smelled damp, like moss and wet earth. The only sounds were the hiss of rain on leaves and the occasional gust of wind rattling the bare branches overhead. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and headed for the cabin. The stone steps were uneven and slick, and the door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp stone. The furniture was sparse. An old armchair, a wooden table, a single bed pushed against the far wall. A fireplace dominated one side of the room, already set with logs and kindling. A single window looked out into the woods, though the darkness outside made it more of a mirror than anything else. I set my bag down, lit a fire, and unpacked my things. The cabin wasn't much, but it had its charm. The stone walls were thick, and the beams overhead looked ancient, scarred with knots and cracks. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, and only the faintest signal on my phone. It felt isolating, but in a way I'd been craving. The rain picked up as the evening went on, hammering against the window and making the fire feel even more inviting. I made a quick dinner from the supplies I'd brought, then settled into the armchair with a book. It was an old habit I'd fallen out of lately, reading for hours without interruptions. But that night, the words didn't hold my attention. I kept glancing at the window, at the way the rain distorted the view outside. Beyond the glass, the woods were just a black void. By the time I decided to call it a night, the rain had turned into a full storm. The wind howled around the cabin, and the branches outside scraped against the walls like claws. I banked the fire, checked the locks on the door, and climbed into bed. The mattress was thin, and the sheets smelled faintly musty, but I was too tired to care. I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind or the rain, but as I lay there, holding my breath, I realized it was something else. A faint thud, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound came again, closer this time. I sat up, straining to hear over the storm. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the room in near darkness. For a moment, I thought about grabbing my phone, but the faint light from the screen would only make me more visible. Instead, I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet cold against the stone floor. The sound came again, and this time, I could tell it was coming from outside. It wasn't just the wind or the rain. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps but heavier. I moved to the window, staying low, and peered out into the night. At first, I couldn't see anything. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the woods were just a dark mass of shifting shadows. But then I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't close enough for me to make out any details, just a shape moving through the trees. It stopped at the edge of the clearing and stood there, facing the cabin. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it watching me. I ducked below the window, my pulse racing. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a storm? My mind raced through possibilities. Someone lost, maybe, or a hunter. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew something was wrong. The figure didn't move for what felt like hours. I stayed crouched by the window, every muscle in my body tense. Finally, I heard it, footsteps, squelching through the mud as the figure moved away. I waited until I was sure it was gone before I dared to stand. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, every sound from outside making me jump. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the window, I was already packed. I didn't care if it made me seem paranoid. I wasn't staying another night. I stepped outside into the cold, gray morning and stopped. There, in the mud outside the cabin, were footprints. They were deep, too large to be mine, and they led from the edge of the clearing to the cabin door. And then they stopped. There were no prints leading away. My stomach dropped. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the woods, but there was no sign of anyone, just the footprints stopping abruptly in the mud. I didn't wait to figure it out. I threw my bag into the car and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I never went back to that cabin, and I never tried to explain what happened. But sometimes, on rainy nights, I think about those footprints, about how they stopped as if whoever or whatever had been out there was still standing, watching me from the shadows. It was the summer of 2012 when my parents sent me to spend a few weeks at my grandmother's farm in northern Idaho. I was 22 at the time, in college, and just looking to get away for a while. Grandma's farm was isolated, tucked away in the woods about 20 miles from the nearest town. It was the perfect place to clear my mind. Her property had always fascinated me. She owned acres of dense forest, a small lake that was perfect for fishing, and, of course, the old wooden cabin she lived in. The cabin itself was a relic from the 1920s, built by her late husband. It had this charm, a mix of creaking wood and the faint scent of pine. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, just peace and quiet. That's what I needed, at least that's what I thought. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dirt driveway. Grandma was out tending her chickens when I pulled up. She waved me over but didn't say much, just smiled and gestured toward the cabin as if to say, "Make yourself at home." The first couple of days went by without much excitement. I'd wake up early to help her with chores, spend the afternoons fishing or reading on the porch, and end the evenings by the fireplace. The isolation was comforting, a break from the noise of the city. But by the fourth day, I began noticing things, small things that didn't sit right. It started with the chickens. Grandma had a large coop behind the cabin, surrounded by a sturdy wire fence. One morning, I went out to collect eggs and found one of the hens lying dead just outside the coop. Its neck was broken, the body untouched. I figured a fox or raccoon had gotten to it, but the fence was intact, and there were no signs of digging. That night, I heard noises. It was a faint rustling, like something moving through the trees just beyond the cabin. I told myself it was the wind or maybe deer. This was the woods, after all. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more deliberate, like heavy footsteps crunching leaves. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head like a kid, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I mentioned the noises to Grandma. She shrugged it off, saying the woods had a way of playing tricks on people who weren't used to them. She told me to stick close to the cabin and avoid wandering too deep into the forest. That seemed like strange advice. I've been exploring those woods since I was a kid. They never felt dangerous before. Later that day, I decided to take a short hike. I stayed close to the cabin, following a familiar trail that looped around the lake. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. About halfway through the trail, I noticed something unusual. A pile of rocks stacked neatly in the middle of the path. They weren't there before. The arrangement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. It gave me an uneasy feeling, so I stepped around it and hurried back to the cabin. That night, the noises returned. This time, they were louder, closer. It sounded like something, or someone, was walking around the cabin. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard it, a soft tapping on the bedroom window. I froze, staring at the curtains, too scared to move. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, like someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. Eventually, it stopped. I waited for what felt like hours before I finally got up the courage to peek outside. There was nothing there, just the dark outline of the trees under the moonlight. I told myself it was a branch brushing against the glass, though deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I checked the window. There were no branches nearby, no signs of anything that could have caused the tapping. My unease grew, but I didn't want to worry Grandma, so I kept it to myself. Over the next few days, things escalated. I'd find strange marks on the ground near the cabin, like scratches or claw marks, but they didn't match any animal I knew of. Tools from the shed went missing, only to reappear in odd places, like the middle of the yard or inside the chicken coop. I started locking the doors at night, something Grandma never did. Then came the night I'll never forget. It was a Friday, and Grandma had gone to bed early. I stayed up reading by the fireplace, trying to distract myself. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time, they were different, faster, more frantic. It sounded like something was circling the cabin, darting back and forth. The chickens were squawking loudly, a panicked frenzy that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, determined to scare off whatever was out there. The air was cold and still, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I shone the light toward the coop and froze. The fence was torn open, the wire twisted and mangled. Feathers were scattered everywhere, but there was no sign of the chickens. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the woods. My flashlight beam swept across the trees, and for a split second, I saw something. It was tall, too tall to be a person, with broad shoulders and long limbs. Its eyes reflected the light, glowing like two small flames. And then it was gone, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. I ran back inside, bolting the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I sat by the window, clutching the flashlight, and waited for dawn. When morning came, I told Grandma everything. She didn't say much, just listened quietly and nodded. Then she told me a story. Years ago, when she and Grandpa first moved to the farm, they'd heard similar noises in the woods. They chalked it up to bears or mountain lions, but one night, Grandpa saw something. A figure watching the cabin from the tree line. He never spoke about it again, but after that, he made sure the doors were always locked at night. I left the farm the next day. Grandma didn't try to stop me. I think she understood. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. The sense that something was out there, waiting. Whatever it wasn't an animal and it wasn't human. And I never went back. In the fall of 2018, I decided to take a break from city life. I was 29 at the time and worked a demanding job that kept me stuck in an office most days. I felt suffocated by the routine and needed to get away, even if just for a week. I booked a remote cabin in Montana. It wasn't fancy, but it was exactly what I wanted. Isolated, quiet, and surrounded by miles of forest. The photos showed a small, sturdy cabin with a wraparound porch, a wood-burning stove, and a view of a nearby mountain range. It seemed perfect. The drive out there was long but beautiful. As I got closer to the cabin, the paved roads gave way to gravel, and eventually, I was driving on a dirt path surrounded by dense woods. My cell service disappeared about an hour before I reached the cabin. That was expected and honestly welcomed. I wanted to disconnect completely. The cabin itself was even more charming than the photos. It was small but well kept, with a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with a couch and a fireplace. There was a shed about 50 yards behind the cabin, filled with chopped wood for the stove and some basic tools. The front porch faced the forest, and the only other structure in sight was an old, broken-down barn about half a mile away. I unloaded my gear, locked up the truck, and settled in. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it exploring the area, walking along the trails near the cabin. The air was crisp, and the silence was almost unnerving at first. I wasn't used to such stillness. That night, I lit a fire in the stove, made myself some dinner, and read a book by lantern light. By 10 p.m., I was already in bed. The darkness outside was absolute, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to hike a bit further into the woods. I packed some snacks, filled a water bottle, and headed out. The trails weren't marked, but they were well-worn and easy to follow. I walked for hours, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of the forest. By the time I made it back to the cabin, it was late afternoon. I was exhausted but felt good. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the peacefulness of the woods was starting to settle into me. That evening, as I was sitting on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, I noticed something odd. The woods, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and insects earlier, had gone completely silent. Not a single chirp or rustle. I brushed it off as my imagination and went inside to make dinner. That night, I woke up to a strange noise outside. It sounded like something heavy moving through the underbrush, slow and deliberate. I stayed in bed, listening intently, my heart racing. Whatever it was stopped just outside the cabin. I held my breath, waiting, but after a few minutes, the noise moved away. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal and forced myself back to sleep. The next day, I decided to check around the cabin for any signs of wildlife. I didn't see much, just some old tracks that could have belonged to a deer or elk. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone or something standing there. But there was never anything. That night, the noises returned. This time, it was louder. Heavy footsteps circled the cabin, pausing by the porch and the windows. I sat in the living room with the lantern off, clutching a kitchen knife, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But animals didn't act like this. They didn't pace or linger. I barely slept. When morning came, I went outside to look for tracks. What I found made my stomach drop. There were footprints in the dirt around the cabin. Bare human footprints, large and oddly spaced, as if whoever made them had an uneven gait. The prints led into the woods but disappeared after a few yards. I stood there, staring at the ground, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a local messing with me, I thought. Maybe some drifter had wandered onto the property. I told myself I'd be fine as long as I stayed alert. That evening, I decided to keep the fire in the stove going all night. The glow of the flames made the cabin feel less vulnerable, less isolated. I sat in the living room, staring out the window, waiting for the footsteps to return. But instead of footsteps, I heard something worse. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees, followed by a sound that almost made me drop my knife. A voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it sounded like it was mimicking my own voice, calling out into the woods. Panic set in. I locked all the doors and windows and turned off the lights, hoping to make the cabin look unoccupied. I sat in the corner of the living room, knife in hand, listening to the sounds outside. The growling and the voice continued for what felt like hours, moving closer and then fading away. Eventually, the sounds stopped, and the forest fell silent again. The next morning, I packed my bags. I wasn't staying another night. I loaded everything into the truck and started the engine. As I backed out of the driveway, I glanced at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. Something standing at the edge of the woods, partially hidden by the trees. It was tall, too tall to be a person, with long limbs and a hunched posture. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze. I didn't wait to get a better look. I hit the gas and sped down the dirt road, my heart pounding. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, hours away. I checked into a motel and spent the night with the TV on and the curtains drawn. The next day, I called the rental company to let them know I was leaving early. They didn't ask for a reason, and I didn't offer one. I never went back to that cabin. For months, I had nightmares about that figure in the woods and the voice that had mimicked mine. To this day, I don't know what I saw or heard, but I've never felt truly alone since. Wherever I go, I always feel like I'm being watched, like something followed me out of those woods. In the summer of 2013, I decided to rent a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. I was 32 at the time, single, and in desperate need of some time away from the grind of my job. The cabin wasn't glamorous, just a single room with a bed, a wood stove, and a table. There was no electricity, no running water, and no cell service. That was exactly what I wanted: peace and quiet. The cabin sat at the end of a 2-mile dirt road that was barely passable. Thick trees lined both sides of the road, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. By the time I arrived and unloaded my gear, it was late afternoon. The air was sticky and warm, and the forest was alive with the hum of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves. I spent the first couple of days hiking and fishing in the nearby streams. It was exactly the escape I needed. At night, I'd light a fire in the stove and read by the glow of a lantern. The woods were eerily quiet at night, with only the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant cry of a coyote to break the silence. On the 4th day, I decided to explore further into the woods. I had seen an old, overgrown trail branching off from the main dirt road, and my curiosity got the better of me. I packed a small backpack with some water, snacks, and a map, just in case, and headed out early in the morning. The trail was narrow and choked with weeds and fallen branches. It was obvious that no one had used it in years. After about an hour of walking, I noticed the trees thinning out ahead. I pushed through a particularly dense thicket of bushes and found myself standing in a small clearing. At the center of the clearing was an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The roof sagged in places, and the windows were broken. The wooden walls were gray and weathered, and the front door hung loosely on its hinges. Something about the cabin made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way it seemed to blend into the forest, almost like it was hiding. Or maybe it was the silence. The forest around the cabin was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Despite my unease, I felt drawn to it. I told myself I'd just take a quick look around and then head back. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the smell of damp wood and mildew hit me immediately. The inside was just as decrepit as the outside. The floor was littered with leaves and debris, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. There wasn't much inside, just a rotting table, a couple of broken chairs, and an old metal stove that was rusted through. In the corner, there was a small pile of what looked like old clothes or blankets. I didn't want to touch them. I didn't stay long. The whole place felt off, like it was watching me. I left and quickly made my way back to my own cabin. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the trees. The next day, I decided to go back. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I needed to. Maybe I was just trying to prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. When I got to the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. The cabin looked different. The front door, which had been hanging open the day before, was now closed, and there were fresh footprints in the dirt outside. They were large, much larger than mine, and led straight to the cabin. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here and might still be inside. I considered turning back, but my curiosity got the better of me. I crept up to the cabin as quietly as I could and peered through one of the broken windows. Inside, the pile of clothes in the corner was gone. In its place was a small, crude bed made of branches and leaves. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone was living here. I backed away from the cabin slowly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural cough coming from inside. My heart nearly stopped. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise I was making. When I got back to my cabin, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle. I didn't sleep that night. Every little noise outside made my heart race. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up my things and loaded them into my car as quickly as I could. Just as I was about to start the engine, I looked back at the trail leading into the woods. Standing at the edge of the trees was a man. He was tall and thin, with long, matted hair and clothes that hung off him like rags. His face was pale and gaunt, and his eyes were dark pits that seemed to stare right through me. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I slammed the car into reverse, turned around, and sped down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I was miles away. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was. I've tried to convince myself that he was just a drifter, someone who had stumbled upon the cabin and decided to stay. But deep down, I know there was something more to it. Something about the way he looked at me, the way the forest seemed to go silent around him. It wasn't normal. I haven't been back to those woods since. I don't think I ever will. And sometimes, late at night, I still see his face in my dreams, watching me from the shadows. It was the fall of 2013 when I decided to take a solo trip to a small cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I was 29 at the time, living in Atlanta, and I had been working a soul-crushing job in tech for 6 years straight. Burnout was creeping up on me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I needed an escape, a quiet, isolated place where I could just breathe, reset, and not think about anything for a while. A friend of mine had mentioned renting out a cabin up in the mountains a few years back, and I'd asked her for the details. That's how I found myself driving for hours through winding roads surrounded by thick, towering trees, heading towards solitude. The cabin was tucked about 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible by a single dirt road that snaked through the forest. I'd picked it for the very reason it seemed inconvenient. No neighbors, no Wi-Fi, no phone service. The owner had assured me the place was well stocked with firewood, had a small generator for power, and even came with a landline phone for emergencies. I brought plenty of supplies with me, non-perishable food, extra batteries, and a couple of books to pass the time. I arrived late in the afternoon. The trees were already starting to shed their leaves, painting the forest floor in shades of orange and red. The cabin was small but cozy, with dark wooden walls and a slanted tin roof. It stood on the edge of a clearing, the forest pressing in on all sides. A narrow creek ran a little ways behind it, its gentle babble just audible from the front porch. I remember thinking how perfect it was. Unpacking took less than half an hour. I stored my food in the tiny kitchen, laid out a sleeping bag on the worn leather couch in the living room, and set a stack of wood by the fireplace. By the time I was finished, the sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake a vague sense of unease. It wasn't fear, exactly, but more like an awareness of how far I was from everything and everyone. The silence was heavy out here, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind or distant call of an owl. I went to bed early, telling myself I'd feel better in the morning. The next day, I spent my time exploring the area. The forest was beautiful, almost untouched. I followed the creek upstream for a while, taking note of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. About half a mile from the cabin, I came across a small clearing. It looked man-made, with patches of dirt where the grass had been worn away. In the center, there was an old fire pit surrounded by half-rotten logs arranged as seats. It didn't seem too unusual, but something about the place felt off. I stood there for a minute listening. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and insects, felt quieter here. I didn't stay long. As I headed back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I was being watched. The feeling didn't leave me even when I reached the cabin. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. The wind had picked up, causing the trees to groan and creak. Around midnight, I thought I heard something outside, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I sat up, straining to listen, but it stopped as suddenly as it had started. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for signs of wildlife. There were no tracks, no disturbed ground, nothing. Still, the feeling of unease was stronger now, like the forest itself had shifted somehow. I told myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't used to this level of isolation, and my mind was playing tricks on me. On the third day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. The fire pit in the clearing still nagged at me, but I didn't want to go back there. Instead, I spent the morning chopping wood and organizing my supplies. By the afternoon, clouds had rolled in, dark and heavy, threatening rain. I was inside, reading by the fireplace, when I heard it again, the crunching sound. This time it was louder, closer. My heart started racing as I crept to the window and peered outside. At first, I saw nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. But then, in the corner of my vision, I caught movement. A figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. They weren't moving, just standing there watching the cabin. I couldn't make out any details. The distance and fading light made it impossible. For what felt like an eternity, I didn't move. Then, as if sensing they'd been seen, the figure stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. I locked the doors and windows, double-checking them twice. The landline phone sat on the small kitchen counter, but when I picked it up, there was no dial tone. The owner had warned me the connection was spotty, but now it felt deliberate, like someone had cut the line. The hours dragged by. I kept the lights off, not wanting to draw attention to myself. The thought of leaving crossed my mind, but driving down that narrow dirt road at night felt just as dangerous. At some point, exhaustion overtook fear, and I dozed off on the couch. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was that the fire had gone out. The second thing was that the front door was ajar. I didn't remember hearing it open. I grabbed the closest thing to a weapon, a heavy fire poker, and slowly approached the door. Outside, the clearing was empty, but the ground was wet from the rain that had started overnight. In the mud, I saw them, footprints leading away from the cabin, back into the forest. I spent the rest of the day on edge, barely eating or moving from the couch. By nightfall, the rain had stopped, leaving the air cold and damp. I piled logs into the fireplace and lit them, hoping the light and heat would make me feel safer. Didn't. Around midnight, I heard the crunching again. This time it was louder, closer. I didn't even bother looking out the window. I knew they were out there, watching. The sound circled the cabin, stopping occasionally before starting again. It was like they were testing me, waiting for me to react. When the footsteps finally stopped, I thought maybe they'd given up. But then I heard something new, a soft tapping sound coming from the back of the cabin. It wasn't the door or the windows. It was the wall itself, like someone was running their fingers along the wood. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed up my things in record time, threw them into my car, and started the engine. The dirt road was slick with mud, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something standing in the clearing, a figure half hidden by the trees. I didn't stop. When I finally reached town, I told the local sheriff what had happened. He listened, nodding along, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Before I left, he told me something that still haunts me to this day. "You're not the first to complain about that cabin," he said. "Something about those woods just makes people uneasy." I never went back to that cabin or any other in the mountains. To this day, I can't explain what happened, and maybe I don't want to. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I'll hear a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves, and I'll wonder if they ever really stopped watching. My name is Mike Carter. I've been a cop for about 15 years, and I've seen some things most people wouldn't believe. I've worked in a small town in Montana, a place where you'd think nothing ever really happens. Quiet streets, friendly faces, and long stretches of open land. That's what people imagine when they think of places like this. But if you work in law enforcement, you know that trouble has a way of finding even the most peaceful corners of the world. It was late October 2015. The leaves had turned shades of orange and red, and the temperature was starting to drop. That particular day, I was pulling a double shift. My partner, Joe, had called in sick, so I was covering for him. It wasn't a big deal. Things had been slow lately. The biggest call we'd had that month was a drunk guy breaking into a gas station to steal beer. Small town problems, you know? The first half of the shift was uneventful, mostly just routine patrols. But around 6 p.m., just as the sun was dipping behind the mountains, a call came through the radio. A man's voice, tense but calm, reported a break-in at his hunting cabin about 40 miles out of town. He wasn't sure if the intruder was still there, but he'd found the front door wide open when he arrived. He said he was too afraid to go inside. Normally, we wouldn't send just one officer to a situation like that, but everyone else was tied up with a car accident on the main highway. Dispatch asked if I could handle it on my own. I agreed. How bad could it be? Most likely, it was just a bear or maybe some teenagers messing around. I grabbed my flashlight, my radio, and my sidearm, and I headed out. The drive to the cabin took about an hour. The road was mostly dirt, winding through dense pine forests. By the time I got there, it was completely dark. The only light came from the high beams of my cruiser and the faint glow of the moon. The air was cold and still, and the cabin stood in a small clearing surrounded by trees. It looked old log walls, a steep roof, and a single porch light that flickered faintly. The man who'd called in was nowhere to be seen. I checked my radio to make sure I had a signal, but it was weak. That wasn't surprising this far out in the woods. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway, and shone my flashlight toward the cabin. The front door was ajar, just as the caller had said. Something about the way it hung open bothered me. It wasn't just unlocked. It looked like it had been forced open. The wood around the lock was splintered, and the door frame was cracked. I called out, announcing myself as law enforcement, but there was no response. My voice echoed through the trees before fading into the silence. I walked up to the porch, my flashlight sweeping back and forth. There were no footprints in the dirt, at least none that I could see. The door creaked as I pushed it open with my shoulder, the sound loud and sharp in the still night. The cabin was small, just one main room with a bed, a table, and a kitchenette. There was a door in the back that I assumed led to the bathroom. The place was a mess. Furniture was overturned, and papers were scattered across the floor. The smell of damp wood and mildew filled the air. I scanned the room with my flashlight, looking for any signs of life, but it was empty. I moved cautiously, my hand resting on my holster. The floor creaked under my weight as I stepped further inside. On the table, there was a half-eaten sandwich and an open can of beer. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry. My flashlight caught something on the floor near the bed, a dark stain that soaked into the wood. I knelt down for a closer look. It was blood, fresh. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't a prank or some drunk teenager. Something bad had happened here. I checked the bathroom, but it was empty. The small window above the sink was open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. Whoever had been here could have escaped through it. I radioed back to dispatch to report what I'd found, but the signal was too weak to get through. I decided to head back to my car and call for backup. As I turned to leave, I heard a noise, a faint creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. I froze, listening. Came again, this time from above me. My flashlight beam shot up to the ceiling, where I noticed a small hatch leading to the attic. The edges were smudged with dirt, as if it had been opened recently. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to open that hatch. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to wait for backup. But I couldn't just walk away. I was a cop. It was my job to deal with situations like this. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and positioned it under the hatch. My flashlight was in one hand, my gun in the other. Slowly, I pushed the hatch open with the barrel of my gun. The hinges groaned, and a cloud of dust fell into my face. I coughed and waved it away, squinting into the darkness above. At first, I didn't see anything. The attic was small and empty, just wooden beams and insulation. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something in the corner. A pile of blankets and what looked like empty food wrappers. Someone had been hiding up there. I climbed down and stepped back, my mind racing. Whoever was in the attic was either gone or hiding somewhere nearby. I decided it wasn't safe to stay in the cabin any longer. As I headed toward the door, I heard it again. A creak, this time from outside. I stepped onto the porch, my flashlight sweeping the tree-line. The forest was thick and dark, the kind of darkness where you can't see more than a few feet in front of you. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any sound. Footsteps, breathing, anything. But all I could hear was the rustling of leaves in the wind. I made my way back to the car, my nerves on edge. Just as I reached for the door handle, I noticed something on the windshield. A handprint smeared across the glass. It hadn't been there when I arrived. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been in the cabin had been watching me. I unlocked the door and got inside, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The headlights lit up the clearing, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the trees. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. I radioed for backup as soon as I had a strong enough signal. By the time they arrived, it was nearly midnight. We searched the area thoroughly but found no sign of anyone. The blood in the cabin was sent to the lab, but it didn't match any records. The caller who'd reported the break-in never showed up, and we couldn't trace his number. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that cabin. All I know is that I've never felt fear like I did that night. Sometimes, when I'm driving those back roads alone, I think about that handprint on my windshield. I wonder if someone is still out there, watching, waiting. That was the night I stopped believing in quiet, safe places.